Imagine if, all of a sudden, all the comforting illusions you hold on to disappeared. The little lies we tell ourselves, the beliefs that help us move forward, everything dissolving, leaving only the harsh and unforgiving truth. Would you be ready to see the world like that, without any filter? Emil Cioran believed that this total clarity, this lucidity, is too heavy a burden to bear, especially when it affects how we connect with others. Instead of bringing us closer to reality, lucidity can end up isolating us, destroying what we value most in human relationships, genuine connection. Lucidity, the ability to see the world without illusions, might seem like a blessing. After all, who wouldn't want to see things clearly? But as this clarity grows, it begins to weigh you down. For Cioran, lucidity isn't just a mental awakening, but a profound transformation that impacts how we connect with people. Imagine that you start noticing all the little details you used to ignore in relationships, the awkward silences, the forced gestures, and the words left unsaid. The more lucid you become, the clearer the gap between what you feel and what others show. This distancing is inevitable because lucidity brings to light the hidden truths that hold our connections together. Think about a simple conversation between friends. How many times have you noticed people avoiding certain topics to keep things harmonious? Or how often do we compliment someone without really meaning it, just to keep the relationship stable? Lucidity tears down that facade. What once went unnoticed now stands out. The concessions, the fears, the subtle lies that maintain the balance. After seeing these truths, is it still possible to maintain the same connections? Extreme clarity transforms human interactions, making them vulnerable to the unforgiving light of truth. The more we see reality without the filters that once protected us, the harder it becomes to sustain our bonds. The light-hearted laughter, the casual conversations, suddenly, they all seem empty, as if they lack depth. Lucidity not only affects how we see others but also the space we occupy in relationships, as if we're slowly distancing ourselves from a scene that no longer touches us in the same way. Illusions play a fundamental role in sustaining our relationships. They allow us to navigate daily interactions without constantly confronting uncomfortable truths that we'd often rather not see. Think about a family dinner. How many times have we avoided certain topics to keep the peace, or pretended everything was fine when, in reality, we were deeply bothered? These little illusions, as simple as they may seem, are essential for making social interactions flow more smoothly. Cioran saw these illusions as a social survival mechanism. They are the cushions that soften the blow of harsh truths. By holding on to these beliefs and subtle lies, we create a version of reality that is bearable, both for ourselves and for others. Without them, every interaction would become a direct confrontation with the truth, which could easily shatter the harmony of relationships. Who hasn't held back from saying what they really think to avoid hurting someone, or hidden their vulnerabilities to avoid appearing weak? When lucidity begins to erode these illusions, the effect is immediate. Relationships lose part of their stability. Seeing the hidden intentions behind every gesture, every word, can make coexistence unsustainable. The illusions that once seemed insignificant now reveal themselves as essential pillars that prevented the collapse of human connections. And without those foundations, what remains? Cioran forces us to consider how much our relationships can truly survive without the illusions that hold them up. Is it possible to live without them? Or would our relationships crumble under the weight of the truth? As the illusions that sustain our relationships begin to unravel, lucidity turns into a destructive force. Cioran describes this clarity as an intense light that illuminates what we would prefer to keep in the shadows. Imagine a house that appears solid, but upon closer inspection, reveals deep cracks in the walls. The more you see, the harder it becomes to ignore the damage. In human relationships, lucidity does the same. It reveals the fragilities, lies, and compromises that once kept everything in balance. Think about a long-standing friendship. As lucidity progresses, you begin to notice how many of the moments you shared were built on unspoken compromises, concessions made to avoid conflict. The words of affection that once sounded sincere now seem laden with hidden intentions. Every gesture, every silence, reveals something that was hidden beneath the veil of coexistence. The more lucid you become, the harder it is to maintain the relationship with the same lightness and closeness. It's as if the exposed truth is eroding the emotional structure that once seemed unshakable. This destruction of connections doesn't happen all at once, but rather in a slow and painful process. Clarity exposes the cracks, and what was once invisible becomes impossible to ignore. The laughter that once brought you together now sounds forced. The conversations that used to offer comfort now feel empty, lacking substance. The more you try to reconnect, the more distant you feel, as if the knowledge gained through lucidity is driving a wedge between you and the people who once seemed essential. Lucidity, then, becomes an invisible barrier, a force that, instead of bringing people closer, destroys the deepest connections. For Cioran, lucidity not only reveals the uncomfortable truths of the world, but also condemns the lucid individual to inevitable isolation. This isolation isn't merely social, it's existential. The more someone sees reality without the filters of illusion, the more they realize the distance that opens up between them and others. Think about what it's like to participate in a casual conversation about trivial matters while carrying the weight of the truth inside. It feels as though you're physically present, but your mind is elsewhere, wrapped up in an understanding of something the others don't perceive. This feeling of isolation is like an invisible wall that rises between the lucid person and the world around them. The awareness of the falsehoods that sustain daily life, the promises of happiness, the search for meaning, alienates the lucid individual from the light-hearted conversations and superficial interactions that once brought some comfort. The more you see the raw truth, the harder it becomes to maintain the same connections with those who remain immersed in their own illusions. It's like being surrounded by people, yet feeling completely alone at the same time. Cioran describes this isolation as a kind of curse. The more someone understands the emptiness and absurdity of existence, the more solitary they become. It's not just about being unable to connect with others, but about feeling that such a connection is impossible. On a deeper level, imagine knowing something that completely changes your view of the world, but not being able to share it with anyone because those around you prefer not to see it. The lucid individual, then, carries a silent burden, living in a world where relationships become distant, devoid of meaning, and loneliness becomes a constant companion. Empathy, usually seen as a bridge to connect us with others, becomes a distorted experience for the lucid individual. Lucidity not only allows them to see the truths about themselves, but also exposes the motivations and vulnerabilities of those around them. What should be an ability to feel with others, to put oneself in their shoes, starts to lose its spontaneity. Empathy, when viewed through the lens of lucidity, often transforms into a cold and distant understanding. Imagine trying to console a friend who is suffering. For most people, this gesture of empathy is filled with emotion and solidarity. However, for the lucid person, clarity reveals that no matter how comforting their words might be in the short term, they cannot change the fundamental nature of human suffering. Pain is inevitable, and any effort to alleviate it feels empty, superficial. Words of comfort become almost a ritual, a learned behavior, but without the same emotional weight they once carried. Cioran believed that lucidity not only affects how we see the world, but also how we interact with it. By seeing suffering as an inevitable part of existence, the lucid person may feel a certain powerlessness when trying to offer empathy, knowing that another's pain is part of the human condition, and that no words, no matter how well-intentioned, can eliminate it, turns empathy into a mechanical exercise. The connection, once warm and sincere, now feels devoid of depth, as if the lucid person is physically there but not fully present. The truth they carry makes the comfort they offer others feel like just another illusion, one that's hard to maintain. For the lucid individual, loneliness is more than just the absence of company. It's an inevitable consequence of extreme clarity. Cioran describes this loneliness as a heavy burden, a feeling of disconnection that stems from the fact that the lucid person sees life in a way that others cannot, or do not want to, see. This loneliness isn't limited to being physically alone. It manifests even when surrounded by people. Imagine being at a gathering of friends where everyone is laughing and having fun, but for you, there's a constant feeling of being out of sync, as if you're seeing the world from a perspective no one else shares. The weight of the lucid person's loneliness comes from the fact that their perceptions of reality separate them from others. Interactions that once felt meaningful now seem empty, as if lucidity has drained the sense from human connections. The more the lucid person understands the truth about life, its emptiness, its lack of intrinsic meaning, the harder it becomes to engage in the same everyday interactions with enthusiasm. Light-hearted conversations feel superficial, gestures of affection lose their warmth, and even moments of intimacy are permeated by a sense of distance. This loneliness is like a constant shadow, following the lucid person in every moment. Even in times when they try to connect, the clarity of their perception of the world places a barrier between them and others. The loneliness of lucidity isn't just emotional, it's existential. Cioran describes this condition as an inevitable consequence of a profound understanding of life's absurdity. The clearer the understanding, the larger the chasm that opens between the lucid individual and others, making this loneliness an ever heavier burden to bear. Despite the isolation that lucidity often imposes, there is a possibility for connection, although this connection is of a different, more difficult, and less common nature. For the lucid individual, human relationships may seem fragile and superficial, but that doesn't mean they're impossible. In fact, lucidity can pave the way for a new kind of bond, one that is more authentic and honest. However, this kind of connection requires both parties to be willing to face life's harsh truths without illusions. Imagine a relationship where sincerity is not just a choice but a necessity. The masks fall away, and what remains is the acceptance of the other as they truly are, without unrealistic expectations or promises of eternal happiness. Lucidity doesn't completely destroy the ability to connect, but it redefines how that connection happens. Instead of building a relationship on comforting illusions, the lucid person seeks something deeper, a bond that acknowledges human imperfection and fragility, yet still holds together. However, this kind of connection is rare. Not everyone is willing to give up the illusions that make life more bearable. Finding someone who shares the same clarity, who is ready to face life without the traditional comforts, is a challenge. But when that connection happens, it is powerful. There are no pretensions of perfection, no illusions that suffering will be avoided. Instead, there is a mutual acceptance of reality, with all its difficulties, and a willingness to walk together, not to escape the truth, but to face it side by side. It is a quiet, yet genuine connection, where what binds people isn't illusions, but lucidity itself. The dilemma between lucidity and human relationships is perhaps one of the most intriguing that Cioran presents. The clarity brought by lucidity reveals the raw and relentless truth of human interactions, exposing the illusions that sustain even our closest connections. On one hand, there is the pursuit of truth, of total clarity that lucidity offers. On the other, there is the human desire to connect, to create deep and meaningful bonds with others. But can these two needs truly coexist? As lucidity exposes the flaws and omissions that once formed the foundation of our relationships, a question arises: how can we continue nurturing these connections when they seem so fragile under the light of truth? The illusions that once comforted us and maintained harmony in relationships begin to unravel, and the truth becomes too heavy to ignore. Is it worth holding on to these illusions to preserve relationships, or is it better to live with the truth, even if that means distancing oneself from others? This dilemma between lucidity and relationships is profound, as there is no easy answer. Lucidity makes it difficult to sustain the same connections as before, but complete isolation is also a heavy burden to bear. The decision to continue maintaining relationships based on illusions or to abandon them in the name of truth is a painful and personal choice. Perhaps, for some, it's possible to find a balance where the truth doesn't completely destroy connections, but this requires a level of mutual acceptance and honesty that is rare. In the end, Cioran leaves us with this reflection. To what extent are we willing to sacrifice truth for connection or connection for truth?